The federal government says it has listened to the concerns of the community by dumping the mandatory $7 GP co-payment. Labor, as we know, has been highly critical of that policy, and the Opposition Leader Bill Shorten joins us in the breakfast studio now. Mr Shorten, good morning to you.
Good morning, Michael.
This is simply a government listening to what voters have been saying. There's nothing wrong with that, is there?
No, this is simply a government who's still introducing a GP tax through the back door. They're making doctors collect the tax for Tony Abbott. It's still a broken promise. And I think every Australian knows that this is the thin edge of the wedge, that Tony Abbott doesn't think his policy's wrong. He just is changing his tactics because he's personally and his government's in political disarray. It's about protecting Tony Abbott and the government. It's not about protecting Medicare.
You argued very strongly the $7 co-payment was unfair because it included pensioners' kids. They're not included in this $5, what the government describes as optional co-payment. Surely that's a better way of trying to plug that Medicare funding gap.
There's no doubt that Labor has had a win in terms of forcing some concessions. But our principal objection was you shouldn't have to pay an additional tax to go to the doctor. The idea that you will discourage sick people from going to the doctor by putting on a tax on GPs and making GPs who are hard working collect the tax, it's poor medical policy. Primary care is important. We don't want people delaying going to the doctor. This is a broken promise, and it also adds to cost of living. So there's millions and millions of Australians who, under this government's so-called changes, will be paying a tax to go to the doctor, which is simply a broken promise. And like the petrol tax, they're going around Parliament and they're trying to force up cost of living pressure on Australians, which is a really bad idea.
By going around Parliament, you're talking about the regulations needed to implement this. Will Labor move to vote against those regulations?
Well, on some of the regulations, the idea that we should be encouraging people not to be shunted through in 6 minutes for a doctor, we are open to considering that there should be better health care policy in the way that patients are treated. But when it comes to the extra $5 tax, the government's been very sort of disingenuous. What they're saying is it's an option if the doctors charge it. So what they're doing is they're putting pressure back on doctors to make decisions on whether or not they want to slug their patients with a cost of living increase, which is, I think, very poor policy. The government should keep to its election promises, no new taxes. They certainly shouldn't be putting cost of living pressure on families, and they certainly they say there's a Medicare crisis, yet the money they're raising they're putting into a future fund, not going into replug any so-called holes in Medicare. So it's still the government hasn't changed what they really think. What they're doing is just trying a different tactic to get up what they believe. Will
the opposition vote against the relevant regulations implementing this change?
Yes, in terms of the GP tax, we're just against a GP tax full stop. It's still a tax, it's still a broken promise, and we don't trust Tony Abbott and his government to not increase the tax at some point in the future.
You talked about the medical research fund. Shouldn't the money go to that in terms of ensuring Australia's long-term future in medical research developments?
There's no question that medical research and science are generally important. This is a government who's cutting billions of dollars out of scientific research, though. Hundreds of scientists at the CSIRO are losing their jobs. They want to introduce $100,000 university degrees, which make it harder for kids to study science in the future. This is not a government who's really interested in research. If they were, they wouldn't be doing all the other cuts to science and research. But my point is, what they're trying to do is use a rationalisation or a false argument to undermine the universal basis of Medicare. This is an attack on bulk billing. It's a tax to go to the doctor. It is definitely a broken promise. It's pressure on cost of living. And we all know that Tony Abbott's only doing this for one reason. Everyone knows he's in political trouble, and his government is. They're not doing it to protect Medicare. They haven't changed their mind. They've just changed their tactics. And if given half a chance, they'd bring back all the nasty stuff, which they're now pretending that they're not doing.
We get back to that fundamental funding gap. The government spends $20 billion a year on Medicare. The levy raises only $10 billion. How would you plug that gap?
Well, 2 points in that. First of all, the government's not proposing to fund any gap. The money which they say they're raising is being put into a future fund.
Okay,
it's not going to... So
how else would you fund the gap then?
But my point is, the government's not trying to fund it. So they've invented a false crisis to justify the GP tax, and it's still a GP tax. They've exempted some people from it, but millions more are going to pay it. The real point here is they say there's a crisis, but they're sending their so-called fire brigade down the street to put out another fire in another house. This isn't fair dinkum by the government. Tony Abbott has changed his tactics, but he hasn't changed his mind. And what was amazing is Peter Dutton on the ABC last night says, well, we always knew that we'd have to compromise. Well, really, Peter Dutton? Why have we spent 7 months kicking this around where you've put your hand on your heart and every other government minister says they're really committed to it? Now what the government says to justify their change of tactics is, oh, well, we knew we'd always have to do this. This nation doesn't have time to waste with silly games from this government. And here's an idea on how we'd help fund any gap. Don't waste money on advertising your rotten higher education changes, and you certainly, if you say there's a funding crisis which justifies a new GP tax through the back door, don't waste money trying to sell these rotten ideas.
OK, that'd go a small way to raising that $10 billion.
It's a good start, isn't it?
If Labor's elected in 2016, it's a problem that will confront you. How would you go about filling that gap that's going to, the spending's going to increase to $34 billion by 2024?
Well, first of all, when we look at the whole challenge of government revenue, Joe Hockey's going to bring down this much awaited mini budget. The government's made a lot of play this week that they've really changed their tune. Well, the fact is they haven't. They haven't spelled out how their paid parental leave changes will work, and we think that's an expensive lemon. On this issue, they're proposing to change the way they do their GP tax and put poor old GP in the middle of weighing up each patient. How does it feel every day you go to your doctor? If you have a job, doctor has to weigh up, do I charge you more or do I charge you less? This is a crazy system, and Peter Dutton, the health minister last night, said he encourages doctors to charge this GP tax. So these guys, they haven't changed their mind at all. The only way we can change the mind of this government when it comes to taxing the sick is change the government. And again, when you talk about savings, they could easily look at just scrapping their PPL scheme and looking at going back to what Labor had. Also, they're now talking about taxing multinationals. Why did they get rid of a whole lot of tax officials who could hunt down the money that large companies aren't paying? So there's another saving they could make.
Do you see some GPs would be in a position to absorb that $5?
Well, it's a wonderful system we've got now where Tony Abbott wants GPs to work out how to fix out Tony Abbott's problem. This idea that it's optional doesn't, I think, really understand. Why are we putting our GPs in the middle of a tax war? Why does the GP have to determine, will they make Tony Abbott break his promise about no new taxes, or will they decide to absorb the loss in funding from the government, thereby keeping Tony Abbott's promise intact? This is a government who's in disarray and chaos.
Just finally, you end the year on a relative political high. You leapt ahead of the Prime Minister in the preferred Prime Minister stakes in the Ipsos poll this week. Do you accept, though, Bill Shorten, that's not so much voters embracing you, they just dislike the Prime Minister?
What I understand is that this year Labor's been strong in its opposition to the government's unfairness, but I don't make a habit of commenting on the polls, but I think what the numbers reflect is that Australians know that Tony Abbott will only ever change his tactics. He won't change who he is. He's broken promises, he's got an unfair budget, and that we've lost a year that Australia will never get back, and I think it is a judgment on the Prime Minister and his government.
Bill Shorten, thanks very much for your time this morning.
Thanks.